Good morning. It's good to see each of you this morning. Grateful for your presence. I have quite a bit of material to cover this morning, so we are going to just jump right in with both feet, as they say. In modern day Israel, what we may know as the Bible lands, there are many traditional sites that are attributed to significant biblical events, especially those surrounding the life of Jesus. Now, traditional sites have a rich heritage surrounding them, going back centuries sometimes. But they cannot be proven conclusively that this is the place where this particular event occurred. Among historians and archaeologists, it is generally accepted that these traditional sites are close in proximity to the actual locations, and so they carry a very, as I said, rich history when associating them with specific events. This is what they call the Grotto of the Nativity. Since the 2nd century, there is a cave that is located under the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and it has been thought of as the traditional place of Jesus' birth. And down in this cave, there are several little alcoves. And one of these alcoves is thought to have held the manger where Mary placed Jesus after he was born. There's another area. This is called Bethany beyond the Jordan. And it is an area in the Jordan River that is about 5 miles north of the Dead Sea. And this is considered to be the traditional site of Jesus' baptism. Again, no particular evidence that says absolutely this is the place, but it has a rich history of being the place associated with the event. Beginning in the 3rd and 4th centuries, there were markers that were erected, including a very large church building that was erected on this site because of its history and being the site of Jesus' baptism. And there are many, many others that you can research and find where they have these traditional places marking significant points in Bible history. But it's important to remember that these locations, they have no bearing on our salvation, nor are we commanded to revere them. All right, they hold no sacred meaning for us, but they are interesting ties to history and to the perception of Christianity and Jesus throughout time. And for me, one of the more interesting traditional sites is known as the Via Dolorosa. Now, the Via Dolorosa, which is translated the way of suffering, is the traditional representation of the route that Christ took as he went from Pilate's judgment hall to Mount Calvary. This is the way that he walked to his cross. And if you go into Jerusalem today, there is a route that you can take that is supposed to take you along the same similar route that Jesus himself walked. And while this route is not mentioned specifically in Scripture, there is a path that was taken. Listen to what John said in John chapter 19, beginning in verse 15. As Jesus is nearing his trial, the end of his trial with Pilate. But they, the Jews, cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. Jesus had a path that he walked, going from Pilate's hall to the Mount of Calvary. The reason I find this site so engaging is not because of the physical path itself, not because of the structure or the brickwork or anything along the way. That's not what makes this site mean so much to me. Rather, of interest is what transpired with Jesus before the path, while he was on the path, and what the path led to. And it should hold a very significant part in all of our hearts. I want us to consider this morning our suffering Savior. We just observed a memorial that we partake of every first day of the week that is to draw our minds back to the suffering and the death of Christ. And I will be the first to admit sometimes my mind has a tendency to wander. It's hard to stay focused on that which we are supposed to. Children are doing stuff in the pews, there's noises, trays are clanging. And so sometimes we might find it hard to keep our focus on what we are supposed to do. I hope that by the end of this lesson, that it will be quite some time before you lose focus. Because we want to look at in detail what our Christ suffered for each and every one of us. Let's consider before the path. The way of suffering began for Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. After Jesus met with His disciples, He went out with Peter, James, and John to the garden to pray, as was His custom, but this was not any ordinary time for prayer. In Mark's account, in Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 34, says, "Then He said to them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." He went a little further and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from Him. Have you ever experienced a weight so heavy that it drove you to your knees? That you could not stand under the weight of this burden that you carried? The Son of God had an emotional burden that is greater than anything we will ever know. He was taking on the sins of humanity. And He said, if there is another way for this to come about, if there is another way that atonement can be made, Lord, let it be so. But not my will be done, but yours. I will see this to the end, if that is your will. At this point, Jesus is falsely arrested and led through a series of mock trials. He is first brought to Annas, who was the former high priest and father-in-law to the current high priest, Caiaphas. The Jews seemed to have a bit more respect for Annas than they did for Caiaphas. Even though he did not have an official role at this point, they still brought Jesus to Annas first. And so Annas kind of conducted his own interrogation of Jesus and was asking him questions. And when Jesus replied to the inquiries of Annas, one of the officers took exception and struck Jesus. How dare you answer the high priest in such a way? Well, for one, he was not the high priest. And for another, Jesus says, if there is wrong I have done, then charge me. If not, then why do you strike me? Jesus knew his innocence. Jesus proclaimed his innocence there. But this was merely the beginning. Going back to the garden, they had bound him as a prisoner. They did not say, will you please come along quietly? We have some questions we want to ask you. They bound him. And as they presented him to Annas, he was still yet bound. Annas, not being able to legally do anything, then sends Jesus still bound to Caiaphas, the current high priest. Being transported as a prisoner through the town, there had been some word sent ahead that they had finally gotten their hands on the man Jesus. And so they had sent and they had gathered the chief priests, the elders, the Sanhedrin council. At this time, it's estimated it might be 2, 3 in the morning. The council is not gathered at that hour of the night. The chief priests and the elders are not gathered at that hour of the night. But yet for this occasion, they came out. And it was here in the presence of Caiaphas that the proceedings turned more hostile. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 63, Caiaphas asked Jesus just a very point-blank question, and he says, "Are you really the Son of God?" Thinking there's no way he'll admit to this. There's no way that this man standing here is going to admit that, yes, I am the Son of God, but Jesus does confirm what you say is true. I am the Son of God. And upon that confirmation, a more severe beating takes place. Up to this point, he has been roughed up in the garden, transported, being bound. In the presence of Annas, he is backhanded by one of the officers. But now, the beatings turn more severe. Look in Luke with me, chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 63. Says, "Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?' And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him." Being blindfolded, not being able to see what's coming, and those gathered around you, taking turns, smacking you across the face. And remember, he is still bound. He is still in chains. There is no defending yourself against blows. No raising your hands in hopes of deflecting one of the oncoming hits. And to be blindfolded, even more so, making it impossible to see what is coming at you. It doesn't end there. Caiaphas is done with Jesus. He has the charge against him that he wants to levy. He knows the punishment that he wants to execute upon Christ, but he does not have the authority to carry it out. And so he sends Jesus to Pilate, delivers him to the praetorium. You see, the Jews were under Roman rule. And while the Jews had a measure of freedom, they were still able to conduct business and employ their religious observances up to a point. The Romans still insisted on controlling issues that could negatively impact Rome and its emperor. And so in a matter such as this, wanting to settle this matter of condemnation of this blasphemous man, they go to the leader of the Romans in their area. The Jews are appealing to a higher authority in hopes of getting the heinous outcome that they desired. But Pilate was dumbfounded by this whole circus. He did not understand the charges being brought. In his eyes, they weren't warranted. There was no evidence. It was just hearsay. He really did not understand why Jesus was being brought to him on such matters. He perceived that the Jews were attempting to abuse his power and sought to appease them. The last thing he wanted was the emperor getting word of a riotous situation in Jerusalem. That would not have reflected well on his own standing. And so, while he did not agree or fully understand the charges, he said in Luke 23 and verse 16, "I will therefore chastise him and release him. I will measure out some form of punishment to this man, and then I'll release him because I really don't see the need in going any further." Now, Jesus had already suffered a pretty hard beating at the hands of Caiaphas and those gathered with him. So he is already in rough shape, to put it mildly. But I want you to look in Mark chapter 15. I want you to look at what Jesus suffered at the hands of the Romans. In Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 15. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison, and they clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Scourging is such a graphic form of punishment. The individual is tied to a post with their arms stretched out above them. My range of motion is limited because of my jacket, but it would have been a lot higher than I can go. And the reason is they wanted to pull the back muscles tight. They wanted there to be tautness there. The instrument that was used would be a handle similar to one of these. A wooden handle that had straps of leather attached called a flagrum. Now on the ends of these straps, some had just knots tied into them. Others had pieces of obsidian, flint, sometimes bone shards, even metal hooks that were tied onto the ends of these leather straps. As the flagrum was used, the straps would severely bruise the skin. The knots tied in the cords would bring bruising immediately upon impact. And then the sharp objects would then rip apart the flesh. Their goal in administering this punishment for those that were handling the flagrum were to actually land the blow in such a way that the sharp points, the hooks, would embed in the flesh. And then give it a jerk. And as the blow came across the back, some of the straps would wrap around and cause other lacerations to the arms and the face. The Romans were very methodical in their administration of this punishment. They would not just land blows willy-nilly wherever they wanted. There was a procedure that they followed. Then they would spread the blows across the whole of the back, usually having two guards that were inflicting the punishment because it was a tiring task. And so they would have one on each side of the condemned, delivering blows all up and down the back, inflicting the most widespread damage. The back, as you can imagine, would be laid open. And it's reported that the worst cases would even have their ribs exposed. We've been switched, right? Growing up, we've been switched, and we know the pain, the stinging that comes with that, the effects of granddaddy or daddy's switch on the back of our legs. Nothing compared to what Jesus was experiencing as he was being scourged. His flesh being laid open. The Romans did not stop with the scourging, however. That wasn't enough for them. After being scourged, they laid a purple robe over his open wounds, mocking his royalty. He was accused of saying, "I am the King of the Jews." So what better way to honor a king than to put a purple robe around him? And what king would not be complete without a crown placed upon his head? They platted a crown of thorns. It's believed that these thorns were from the jujube tree. Now, these thorns are not like the stickers that we find on blackberry bushes. You reach a little too far in to get that nice big juicy berry and, ooh, get a little poke. No. The thorns on this particular tree would grow to 1 to 2 inches in length. Consider them as wooden needles. And they did not take this crown and gently set it just on top of Christ's head. They pressed it down. They took a reed and they struck him over the head, driving the thorns into his scalp, fastening it to him. And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." Oh, we worship you, Almighty Son of God, King of the Jews. After they were done with their little mocking session, they removed the purple robe that they had placed on him. Given the nature of the scourging that he had just endured, the robe would have become adhered to the back of Jesus. Laying such a garment over such ghastly wounds, the fibers would become stuck. And do you think they gently removed the corner like slowly pulling off a Band-Aid? They ripped it off his flesh. In doing so, opening the wounds all over again. At this point, Jesus is suffering immensely. And he hasn't even left Pilate's hall. The mock trials are now concluded. Pilate comes back after scourging Christ, after him being mocked, still wearing the crown of thorns, but not the purple robe. And he presents Christ to the Jews. And he said, "Here is your king. I find no fault in him. I am releasing him." And they said, "Crucify him." Pilate washes his hands of the matter. "This man's blood be upon you," he says. And so the Jews, taking that as Pilate's affirmation of what they are wanting to do, proceed to move Jesus from Pilate's hall to Mount Calvary with the assistance of the Roman guard. So now we come to Jesus actually walking the way of suffering. Now it's thought that the distance Jesus would have walked between Pilate's hall and Calvary is close to 650 yards. And at first I was like, well, it doesn't sound that far, right? That's what our mind goes to. You know, we're not talking about miles and miles of walking. So I did a little measuring. It would be similar to walking from the building here to the volunteer market just up the road. Back to here, to the market one more time, and then back to Milton's house. 650 yards. And you're going up in elevation the entire way. Mount Calvary was above Jerusalem. And so from this point, beginning here where they think Pilate's hall was, he would have walked down this way, turned a corner, come up this way to the Mount of Calvary, going uphill the entire way, bearing His cross. 650 yards uphill. It's hard enough for me to do as I am now. But I haven't endured Roman scourging. I'm not wearing a crown of thorns. And I am not carrying a wooden cross. The Romans had streamlined the crucifixion process. The vertical posts of the cross that they used, they were permanently fixed in the ground. There were a series of crosses that sat on top of Calvary. And those that were condemned to crucifixion would carry the horizontal beams up to Calvary. But these beams were not small. It's estimated that they weighed around 100 pounds. So now we have another element added to this way of suffering. In addition to all the torture and punishment that He has endured, the nature of the walk being as far as it is, the elevation as it is, He is now carrying 100 pounds on His back. And as Jesus is walking up this path, carrying this heavy beam, I want you to picture what Jesus would have looked like and been feeling. The crown of thorns still fastened upon His head. You carry anything over your shoulders without bumping your head. You can't do it. His face would be bruised and swollen from the beatings. Remember, this started back in the house of Caiaphas. And he would have been feeling the effects of those first beatings. His back was ripped open from the scourging. And having been ripped open again after the purple robe was taken off of him, he would have been weakened from the loss of blood and thirst. It's no wonder that Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 14, "So His visage was marred more than any man, and His form more than the sons of men." Jesus was beaten to the point that He was almost unrecognizable as a human being. He was just this mess of a person that's walking through the streets of Jerusalem, carrying His cross in this death procession. We don't know how far Jesus went before Simon of Cyrene was forced to bear the beam for Jesus. And we're not told the reason why. In all the gospel accounts that records this event, we do not know why Simon was forced to bear the cross for Christ. Maybe he was walking too slow. Romans were wanting to get up there and get this done. Jesus in His condition was just not moving fast enough, so they had somebody help Him carry the burden. Physically, maybe Jesus just wasn't able to. With everything that He had been through, people usually didn't live past the scourging. It was a punishment that had death at the end of it. And so for the Romans, this was kind of new territory. Well, this man, he is beyond what we're used to. And he's not going to be able to carry the cross up the hill. Maybe carrying the full distance, maybe if Jesus carried the cross the full distance, that would have killed him. And the Romans intervened. It was prophesied that Jesus would die on the cross, not under the cross. And so Jesus was going to make it to the end of that road. The why really doesn't matter at the end of the day. We can speculate and come up with theories, but what is certain is that as Jesus walked the path leading to Calvary, He did so knowing what lies ahead. He knew what the end result was going to be. Before the garden, He knew what the end result was going to be. And yet here He is walking on the way of suffering. Upon reaching Calvary, Jesus would have been forced to lay down with all His injuries and have His arms outstretched on the beam that He and Simon had just carried up the hill. And then nails or spikes would have been driven through His hands, fastening Him to that very beam. There are two views regarding how Jesus was fastened. One states that the nails were put through the palms of Jesus' hands. Another states that no, that wouldn't have worked. They put them through His wrist, which is a more secure point for this type of punishment. And really, arguments can be made for both views. In studying for this, I read a lot of articles and commentaries talking about this, and both views have very good points to make. But at the end of the day, Scripture was fulfilled. In Psalm 22, verse 16, it says, "For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." After having His hands nailed to the beam was lifted and set atop the vertical post. And this was not done with any measure of gentleness. After being lifted up, His legs would have been slightly bent at the knees. His feet crossed, overlapping. And then a third spike driven through His feet, fastening Him to the vertical post. The weight pulling down on the victim would have caused suffocation. That is how many of those that were crucified perished. It wasn't through extreme blood loss or anything like this. It was through suffocation. They couldn't breathe. The posture that Jesus was put in. Remember, I said He had His knees bent just a little bit. That posture would allow the victim to push themselves up on the nails in order to get a breath or two. Gasping for air, knowing that it's going to be painful if you do, but painful if you don't. The victim instinctively would struggle to lift themselves up, take a couple deep breaths, and then slump back down, their weight against those nails once again. The pain would have been excruciating. I cannot even begin to imagine the level of pain that Christ was in at this point. I've had several kidney stones in my life. And I will not stand here and say that they even come close to experiencing what Jesus was experiencing right now. From His arrest to His death was around 13 hours. From the time that He was taken in the garden to the point of Him being on the cross, 13 hours of going through these ordeals, these mock trials, listening to people lie about who you are and what you have said. Jesus was nailed to the cross, still wearing the crown of thorns. They never took it off. The pain from the beatings becoming more acute. His shredded back rubbing against the wood with each movement. His ears filled with the mocking and the hatred spewed by His enemies. Jesus spent 6 of those 13 hours hanging on the cross. And all this was for us. Every single drop of blood, every single tear that was shed was for us. I want you to look with me. Isaiah chapter 53. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from Him. He was despised, and we did not esteem Him. Surely He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed Him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon Him, and by His stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on Him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and He was afflicted, yet He opened not His mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so He opened not His mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare His generation? For He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people He was stricken. His sacrifice paid for our transgressions. Jesus suffered pain and humiliation as a just and innocent man because of the sins that we commit. Will you continue to sit here and say, no, thank you? Will you, after knowing what Jesus went through, still reject the salvation that is offered? The sacrifice of Christ is, was, and ever will be the most powerful sacrifice offered. The power that can be found in His sacrifice covered all those righteous before Him during His time, and everyone that would come after Him has access to that power. Will you still sit here and say, no, I don't want it? I don't want God's salvation. You may be thinking, oh yes, I do, I just don't want it now. Then you don't want it. When you hear of all the pain that Jesus went through, knowing it was for you, I pray that this stirs in your heart and that it convicts your conscience to no longer put off the salvation that is being offered right now, because there will come a time when there will be no second chances. There will come a time when it will be the last time when you say no, and there is nothing you can do about it except the decision you make right now. Jesus knowingly suffered because it was His Father's will and because of what it meant for mankind. He knew the end result. You, my friend, know the end result. When time ends in this life, it begins somewhere else. What you do now determines the nature of that eternal time. God's invitation is open for those that are willing to accept it. If you are outside the body of Christ, please consider what is holding you back. If there's a conversation that I can have with you to help answer any questions, then please get with me afterwards and we will talk until we have this resolved. If you know within your heart that salvation is not yet yours, then don't squander this opportunity. Please come down to the front as together we stand and sing.